The whole visible cosmos is only an imperceptible atom in the ample bosom of nature. The eternal silence of infinite space terrifies me. The 17th century mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote those words as part of his own personal attempt to reconcile the scientific discoveries of his time and his own religious faith. And the second quote is shared by George Crumb in his program notes for the Makrokosmos, which we will be presenting momentarily, a work in 12 parts, each named after a different sun sign of the zodiac. I first heard about this piece about 20 years ago when George Crumb visited my undergraduate school as a composer in residence. And the focus of his visit was the Makrokosmos. It was my first encounter with him as a composer, with these pieces, with this kind of music in general. All of it was just totally new to me. And I was struck not just by the expansive, coloristic palette that he got out of the piano with techniques I'd never seen before, but also with the scores themselves that are organized in these mysterious swirls and circular arrangements rather than the traditional linear layout of Western notation. And during that residency, we had the opportunity to discuss the piece with him, and I recall wanting him to talk about the mystical influences of the work. And I asked him specifically about the circular nature of the scores. What did they mean? Why did he come to them in the first place? He has this very particular Appalachian drawl, and he said, well, I was having breakfast one morning, and my coffee can made a ring on a sheet of paper, and underneath it, and I thought, well, that's interesting, so I drew another circle around it, and then a few more, and, well, there you have it. And I was disappointed. Clearly, these beautiful scores were dripping with mystical significance, compounded by the dark primordial sounds of the compositions themselves. Where was the vast terror of the infinite that so clearly influenced this work? There was no way this masterpiece could be influenced by a coffee can. And honestly, this conversation with him troubled me for many years. I thought, why did he not feel comfortable expanding on some of the big ideas that you could read about in his program notes for the piece? References to Bartók's Makrokosmos, Debussy's mystical piano preludes, the zodiac itself. I eventually came to assume that these influences were perhaps too personal and dear to him to bring up in public conversation, which honestly left me feeling a little sad. I mean, I've seen similar things in my own work and in the musical world around me, and it's one of the reasons that we started the Resonance Collective in the first place, so we could overtly make connections between these delicate, sacred ideas and our own musical conversations. But in conversation with Nick Gerpy and learning more about Crumb as a person and the influences on his music, I've had some other thoughts about his reticence. You see, in addition to the quotes that I mentioned at the beginning, Blaise Pascal also wrote, "The human body, imperceptible in the vastness of the universe, is a colossus in comparison with the parts that make it up. What then is humankind in the midst of these two infinities?" So perhaps the essence of the piece is not the mystery of fate and the zodiac or the power of hidden symbols, but the experience of one person alone at the piano, contemplating the sky and their place within that vastness, the macrocosmos and the microcosmos in juxtaposition, and the musician floating somewhere in between. I think all the great pieces of art encapsulate big ideas. They transcend the original author, and they take on powerful meaning on a cultural level. But for the artist themselves, at least for George Crumb, these large ideas are only an entry point into the real mystery, that of another human being. That's what the horoscopes are about. in a way, right? Not the overarching energy of the zodiac, but how we shape their meaning as individuals so they may speak to our lives. And yes, each piece of the Makrokosmos begins with the name of a particular sun sign, but they also end with a set of initials, friends of Crumb, that were born under those signs. So this project, the Makrokosmos 50 project, continues this trajectory in a sort of reverse of the Crumb, right? With Nick as performer commissioning 12 composers he knows and admires to write responses to the original pieces by Crumb. The goal, of course, is great new music, but the heart of the project is interhuman connection. And during one of our early conversations about this concert, Nick said, "Oh, everybody has a George Crumb story." And I love that. I love that this great composer who is famous and revered is available and approachable enough that many people, including myself, can claim these little personal stories. Sure, Crumb may have been shy about the impossibly large ideas that influence his work, but maybe he also just wanted to connect person to person because he was less interested in being a legend and more interested in us as human beings. So, to paraphrase the Southern Choral director Jonathan Talberg, a successful musician must do two things. They must love music, and they must love people. Look, sometimes humanity can be a difficult group to love. And if that's a struggle for you, I suggest instead looking at the individuals who make up the human collective. Individuals are easy to love, perhaps almost easier than a grand, big idea, and I think certainly more powerful. Loving an idea might offer us inspiration, but it's when we direct our purpose and meaning to specific people that a whole new world opens up. I think this concert is an opportunity to look up and to wonder at the great mystery above us, but it's also an opportunity to look across at each other and wonder at the mystery there, too.